Teshub. Teshub was the Hurrian weather god as well as the head of the Hurrian pantheon. The etymology of his name is uncertain, though it is agreed it can be classified as linguistically Hurrian. Both phonetic and logographic writings are attested as a deity associated with the weather. Teshub could be portrayed both as destructive and protective. Individual weather phenomena, including winds, lightning, thunder, and rain, could be described as his weapons. He is also believed to enable the growth of vegetation and create rivers and springs. His high position in Hurrian religion reflected the widespread importance of weather gods in northern Mesopotamia and nearby areas, where in contrast with the South agriculture relied primarily on rainfall rather than irrigation. It was believed that his authority extended to both mortal and other gods, both on earth and in heaven. However, the sea and the underworld were not under his control. Depictions of Teshub are rare, though it is agreed he was typically portrayed as an armed, bearded figure, sometimes holding a bundle of lightning. One such example is known from Yazilakaya. In some cases, he was depicted driving in a chariot drawn by two sacred bulls. According to Song of Emergence, Teshub was born from the split skull of Kumarbi after he bit off the genitals of Anu during a conflict over kingship. Ew. This tradition is also referenced in other sources, including a hymn from Aleppo and a Luwian inscription. A single isolated reference to the moon god Kusu being his father instead is also known. In individual texts, various deities could be referred to as his siblings, including Saska, Tazmisu, and Aranza. His wife was Hepat, a goddess originally worshipped in Aleppo, at some point incorporated into the Hurrian pantheon. Their children were Saruma, Alonzu, and Kunzisali. Other deities believed to belong to the court of Teshub included Tenu, Pentakali, the bulls Seri and Huri, and the mountain gods Namni and Hazi, or Hazai. Members of his entourage were typically enumerated in so-called Kaluti, Hurrian offering list. God list indicate that Teshub could be recognized as the equivalent of other weather gods worshipped in Mesopotamia and further west in Syria, including Adad and Ugaritic Baal. In Anatolia, he also influenced Hittite Tarhuna and Luwian Tarhuns, though all of these gods were also worshipped separately from each other. The worship of Teshub is first attested in the Third period, with the early evidence including Hurrian theophoric names and in a royal inscription from Urkesh. Later sources indicate that his main cult center was the city of Qum, which has not yet been located with certainty. His other major sacred city was Arapa, the capital of an eponymous kingdom located in the proximity of modern Kirkuk in Iraq. Both of these cities were regarded as religious centers of supra-regional significance, and a number of references to Mesopotamian rulers occasionally sending offerings to them are known. In the Mitanni Empire, the main site associated with him was Kahat, or Kahat, in northern Syria. In Kizilwatna in southeastern Turkey, he was worshipped in Kumani. Furthermore, due to Hurrian cultural influence, he came to be viewed as the weather god of Aleppo. He was also worshipped in many other Hurrian cities, and in the second half of the second millennium BCE, he was the deity most commonly invoked in Hurrian theophoric names, with numerous examples identified in texts from Nuzi. He is also attested as a commonly worshipped deity in the Ugaritic text, which indicate that Hurrian and local elements were interconnected in the religious practice of the city. Additionally, he was incorporated into Hittite religion and Luwian religion. His hypostasis associated with Aleppo attained particular importance in this context. Multiple Hurrian myths focused on Teshub are known. Most of them are preserved in Hittite translations, though the events described in them reflect Hurrian rather than Hittite theology. Many of them focus on Teshub's rise to the position of the king of the gods and his conflict with Kumarbi and his allies, such as the sea monster Hedamu, the stone giant Ulikumi, or the personified sea. These texts are conventionally referred to as the Kumarbi cycle, though it has been pointed out that Teshub is effectively the main character in all of them, leading to occasional renaming proposals. Teshub is also a major character in the Song of Release, whose plot focuses on his efforts to secure the liberation of the inhabitants of Aigen-Galis from Elba. Two of the preserved passages additionally deal with his meetings with Ashara, the tutelary goddess of the latter city, and Alani, the queen of the underworld. Interpretation of the narrative as a whole and its individual episodes remained matters of scholarly debate. Additional references to him have been identified in a number of literary texts focused on human heroes, including the tale of Apu and the Hurrian adaptation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Multiple Romanizations of the name Teshub are in use in Assyriological and Hittitological literature, including Teshub, Teshub, Teshab, and Teshop. The transcription of the voiceless sibilants is a modern convention which reflects the common cuneiform spellings of the name, but writings with not only S but also S and T are all attested in various scripts. Texts from Nuzi record multiple syllabic spellings, including the most common Teshub, T-E-S-U-B, as well as T-E-S-U-U-B, T-E-E-S-S-U-B, and T-E-E-S-S-U-U-B. And rare, T-E, what is that, underscript 9 sub, T-E-E-S 15 suub, and Teshub, the last of which is only attested once in the entire corpus. Additional shortened forms such as T-E, T-E with the long script Tia, were used in the writing of theophoric names. It has been suggested that their development can be compared to the possible derivation of the hyperchoristic suffixes se, say, and saya from the word sina, brother. In names from Alalak, it was rendered as te-es-su'ub. In Mitanni letters, it is written as te-es-su'uba. This form seemingly reflects the pronunciation of Teshub. Attestations of uncommon variants with the suffix a are limited to the theophoric names from various sites. In the Ugaritic alphabetic script, the name was consistently rendered as TTB, with only a single attestation of a different variant, TTP. Dennis Party vocalizes this form of the name as Teshub, Tettub. Multiple variants occur in the text from the same city written in standard syllabic cuneiform. For example, Teshub, T-E-S-A-B, T-E-S-U-B, or Iskerub, and Tinub. In Luwian hieroglyphics, the name could be rendered as Taisupi, or Yazalekaya, or Deus Fortis Supasa from Tel Amar, with an additional shortened form Tanitras Pasa, or Tispa, or Tisapa, attested in theophoric names from Carchemish. The precise etymology of Teshub's name is unknown, but it is assumed it has Hurrian origin. Volkert Haaz suggested it was derived from the adjective Tethai, which he translates as high or lordly. However, Daniel Schwimmer points out that this proposal does not provide an explanation of the suffix, and that Tethai is not an actually attested word. Marie-Claude Tremoule notes that while a connection with the term tes, attested as an equivalent of the Sumerian title Ugula, or overseer, has been suggested, the evidence remains unconvincing. Logographic writings. In addition to phonetic syllabic spellings, Teshub's name could be represented in cuneiform by the Sumeragram Isker. The same sign could also be read as Im, wind or storm. Therefore, the Sumeragram is sometimes rendered as Im in Assyriological literature, though the transcription Isker is considered preferable. The use of logograms of Sumerian and Akkadian origin to represent the names of various deities was widespread across the ancient Near East. Isker is first documented as the representation of the name of a different weather god than Ishkur in the case of Adad in pre-Sargonic text from Marai, though this scribal convention was unknown farther west in Ebla in the same period. In some cases, it is uncertain which deity was represented by Isker. For example, a theophoric name from Alaka, Ari Isker, might invoke either Teshub or Adad. The identity of the weather god worshipped in Nuzi and other nearby cities is also ambiguous in some cases due to use of logograms and the presence of speakers of both Hurrian and Akkadian in the area. It has been noted that speakers of Semitic languages and Hurrians might have in some cases read the logogram differently. While the theophoric names, it is generally advised to render it according to the linguistic affinity of the other component. The existence of unusual bilingual hybrid names have been noted, one example being Ikun Teshub. A further attested logographic writing of Teshub's name is Tin, though it started to be used later than Isker. This logogram is sometimes rendered as simply U in modern literature due to the cuneiform sign having both of these values depending on context. However, Marie-Claude Tremoule argues this transcription is erroneous in this case. The use of this numeral to render the names of weather gods is first documented for Adad in the 15th century BCE. This convention might have originated in northern Mesopotamia or in Syria, but Daniel Schwimmer argues that it also cannot be ruled out it was a Babylonian tradition in origin, and that at the very least it must have developed as an addition to the well-attested system of using other numerals to represent Mesopotamian theonyms, 30 for Sin, 20 for Shamash. Two logograms were used to refer to Teshub in hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions. L318 and Fortis. They differ from the default weather god logogram in this writing system, Deus confirmed and disputed cognates. It is agreed that Teshub's name is a cognate of the Eurasian theonym Teshub or Teshub. This god is only attested in sources from the 1st millennium BCE. Eurasian and Hurrian belonged to the same language family as Euro-Eurasian languages, but they already separated in the 3rd millennium BCE, and Teshub's presence in the Eurasian pantheon cannot be considered the result of the language descending from the Hurrian. In contrast with Teshub's status in Hurrian religion, he was not the head of the pantheon, but rather the second most important god after Haldai, though according to Daniel Schwimmer, this should be considered a secondary development. It has also been proposed that a connection existed between the names of Teshub and Tishpak, a Mesopotamian god regarded as the city deity of Eshnunna. This hypothesis was originally formulated by Thorkild Jacobson in 1932, but by the 1960s, he had abandoned it himself and instead started to advocate interpreting Tishpak's name as a derivative of Akkadian Sapaku to be translated as the downpouring one. However, this etymology is not regarded as plausible today. More recently, support for the view that Tishpak might have been related to Teshub has been voiced by Alfonso Arshai, who suggests the Mesopotamian god developed through reception of the Hurrian one in Diyala area. Manfred Krebernick instead classifies the name of Tishpak as Elamite. Martin Stahl also tentatively describes it as such. Daniel Schwimmer states that there is presently no evidence confirming the identification of Teshub and Tishpak as related deities. The character. The two primary roles associated to Teshub in Hurrian religion were those of a weather god and of the king of the gods. He was regarded both as a destructive figure and as a protector of mankind. He controlled thunder and lightning, amidst various weather phenomena, including storms, lightning, rain, and wind, function as his weapons. He was responsible for securing the growth of vegetation by sending rain. As an extension of his link with vegetation and agriculture, he could be connected with rivers. A Hurro-Hittite ritual, CTH 776, refers to him as the creator of rivers and springs. The high status of weather gods in Upper Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia reflected the historical reliance on rainfall and agriculture. In contrast, in southern Mesopotamia, where it depended chiefly on irrigation, the weather god Ishkur, or Adad, was a figure of comparatively smaller significance. Teshub's royal authority was believed to extend to both gods and mortals. According to Hurrian tradition, his domain included both the heavens and the earth, but the sea and the underworld were areas hostile to him. He was accordingly referred to as the Lord of Heaven and Earth, in An-Uki. This epithet might be derived from a Syrian tradition. The two most common titles applied to him were Iri, Lord, and Sari, King, or Sarai. The context in which the term Uri was used was different from that of Sarai or Sari, as the former referred to ordinary historical rulers as well, while the latter was limited to the sphere of myth. Further related epithets of Teshub include Sarai Talawazi, Great King, and Sarai Anazi, King of the Gods. It is also known that one of the ceremonies in honor of him revolved around the concept of Sarasi, kingship. A single text refers to him as Enazi, god of the gods. Piotr Tarasha argues that Teshub was initially not the head of the Hurrian pantheon and only reached this position as a part of what he understands as a broader phenomenon of growing prominence of weather gods in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Gernot Wilhelm similarly considers it a possibility that he acquired this role in the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. However, Daniel Schwimmer argues that Teshub's status as the supreme deity of the Hurrian pantheon belonged to him since the dawn of recorded history, and arguments on the contrary lack solid proof. He points out that the small number of early theophoric names invoking him cannot be necessarily used as evidence, as other major Hurrian deities, such as Saska or Kumarbi, are not attested in the early Hurrian onomasticon at all, and non-theophoric names predominate. Support for Schwimmer's views have been voiced by Alfonso Archai. Iconography. Depictions of Teshub are rare. The identification of individual weather gods in the art of the ancient Near East is considered difficult, and according to Albert Dietz, in many cases is outright impossible. It has been suggested that Teshub was typically depicted dressed in a short skirt and pointed shoes, sometimes standing on a bull, mountains, or mountain gods. According to Volkert Haas, in glyptic art from Newsy, he is depicted holding a 3-pronged lightning bolt and a curved sword. Textual sources indicate he was believed to travel in a chariot drawn by 2 bulls. A second animal associated with him might have been the eagle. In Hittite art, all weather gods, among them Teshub, were depicted similarly, with long hair and beard, dressed in conical headdress decorated with horns, a kilt, and shoes with upturned toe area, and with a mace either resting on the shoulder or held in a smiting position. In the Yazilakaya sanctuary, Teshub is portrayed holding a 3-pronged lightning bolt in his hand and standing on 2 mountains, possibly to be identified as Namni and Hazai, or Hazi. He is also depicted on a Neo-Hittite relief from Malatya, where he rides in his chariot drawn with bulls and is armed with a triple lightning bolt. Franz Wigerman assumes that some depictions of a weather god accompanied by a naked goddess might represent Teshub and an unidentified deity rather than Mesopotamian Adad and Shalah, or Shelah. A distinct iconography is attested for the weather god of Aleppo, who could be identified as Teshub. His attribute was an eagle-shaped chariot. It has been suggested that its form was meant to reflect the belief that this vehicle was as fast as the bird it was patterned after and its ability to travel across the sky. Associations with other deities. Family and court. Teshub was regarded as the son of Anu and Kumarbi. The former was a deity received from Mesopotamia, and outside of being the father of Teshub, did not play a major role in Hurrian religion. The circumstances of the weather god's birth are known from the Song of Emergence, which relates how Kumarbi bit off the genitals of Anu during a battle over kingship in heaven, and how his skull had to be split to let his son out. A Hurrian hymn, KUB 47.78, also alludes to the events known from this myth, referring to Anu as Teshub's father and Kumarbi as his mother. You are the strong one, which I praise. The bull calf of Anu. You are the strong one, which I praise. Your father Anu begot you. Your mother Kumarbi brought you to life. For the city of Aleppo I summon him. Teshub for the pure throne. A single text, KUB 33.89, preserves a different tradition about Teshub's parentage and refers to the moon god Kusu as his father, or Kusa, or Kusa. But this attestation remains isolated and its broader implications are uncertain. The passage is entirely logographic, and in the past it has been interpreted as a possible reference to a Hattian tradition instead, with the weather god being Taru and the moon god Kasku, but according to Georg Klinger, this interpretation is not plausible. The Song of Emergence also states that Tasmisu and Aranza, the river Tigris, were born alongside Teshub. According to Piotr Tarasha, the former was specifically regarded as his twin. He also functioned as his divine vizier, Sukal. The latter role could be also attributed to Tenu, a god who might have originated in the local tradition of Aleppo. A further deity counted among Teshub's siblings was his sister Sauska. In the Song of Lama, she addresses him as her younger brother. However, Daniel Schwimmer argues that she might have originally been regarded as his spouse. In myths, she is often portrayed assisting Teshub in battle. Beat Pongritz Leston argues that Teshub and Sauska, who she treats as interchangeable with Mesopotamian Adad and Ishtar, were already paired in the early Hurrian inscription of Tish Atal with the goddess Balat Nagar, who occurs in it according to her representing a local hypostasis of Sauska. However, the theory that the tutelary goddess of Nagar was a form of Sauska or Ishtar has been critically evaluated by Joan Goodnick Westenholz, who remarked that these goddesses did not have anything in common with them beyond also being imagined as female figures. Hepat was regarded as Teshub's wife. She was received by the Hurrians from the local pantheon of Aleppo. It is possible that she and Teshub were already paired with each other in Old Babylonian Marai, as indicated by one of the letters sent to King Zimri Lim. Its sender states in it that she will pray before a weather god designated by the Sumerogram Iskar and Hepat for the king. Hepat was already regarded as the spouse of the local weather god, originally known as Hadda, in the 3rd millennium BC. She was chiefly worshipped in northern Syria, especially in Aleppo and Alalak, though the area associated with her also encompassed southern Anatolia and the middle Euphrates. It has been suggested that the recognition of the connection between her and Teshub was limited to Western Hurrian communities. However, the Mitanni royal family was familiar with her as well, as evidenced by her presence in theophoric names of some of its members, which might indicate she was also recognized as Teshub's wife further east. Despite the connection between her and Teshub, Hepat was not referred to with a feminine equivalent of his title, Sarai, and her corresponding epithet was ally or ale, lady, instead. The deities regarded as their children were Saruma, Alonzu, and Kunzi Sali. The first of these three could be referred to as the bull calf of Teshub, though according to Gernot Wilhelm, the familial connection between them should be considered a relatively late development. Pentakali, or Belet Ekalem, A Mesopotamian goddess at some point incorporated into the Hurrian pantheon could be designated as a concubine of Teshub, Nasartia, or Saim. Offering lists in some cases mention a solar disk, Sapsi He Sami, dedicated to her. In Hurrian context, she could be linked to Pithanu or Pythanu. Volkert Haas, who rendered this theonym as Bithanu, translated this name from Akkadian as the Hanian daughter and suggested that she was a deified epithet of Belet Ekelem. Both of them appear in a Hittite list of offerings to Teshub of Aleppo. Pithanu is also mentioned in the text KUB 45.28 plus 39.97, which states that down at Teshub's throne sits Pithanu or Pythanu. According to Haas, it should be considered a description of the arrangement of statues of deities. While it has been argued that Ishara might have been the partner, Parhedra, of Teshub in Old Babylonian Ebla, as well as in Emar and Alalak, no evidence supporting this proposal has been identified. Teshub's chariot was pulled by two bulls, Sarai and Hurai. Sarai was believed to mediate between humans and his master, while no distinct role is attested for Hurai. In the song Uli Kumi, he is replaced by Tilla, but this theonym is better attested as the name of a fully independent god popular in Nuzi. According to Daniel Schwimmer, the latter was typically not associated with Teshub, and there is no evidence he was imagined as a bull in the areas where his worship is best attested. Two further deities belonging to the circle of Teshub in offering lists often placed after his bulls were Nami and Hazai. Namni, and Hazai. These mountain gods might have been worshipped alongside him in Aleppo, though no direct evidence in favor of this view exists. The association between mountain gods and weather gods has a long history across Syria and Anatolia, and might be first documented in a text from Ebla, which invokes Hada alongside Amaric. Hurrian offering lists, so-called Kaluti, preserve long sequences of deities associated with Teshub. The standard version was arranged according to importance and included Teshub himself, as well as deities such as Tazmisu in Sapinua, followed by Anu, Kumarbi, Ea, Kusu, Semij, Saska, Astabi, Nupatik, Paringir, Hesui, Ursapa, Tenu, Earth and Heaven, Mountains and Rivers, Saruma, Seri and Huri, or Sarai and Hurai, Namni and Hazai, Ugur of Teshub, hero of Teshub, ancestors of Teshub, and various attributes and cultic paraphernalia related to him. Goddesses generally belonged to the Kaluti of Hepat instead. This separation by gender is presumed to be a Hurrian innovation, and there is no indication that it was instead derived from Assyrian Amorite or pre-Amorite tradition. Syro-Mesopotamian weather gods. Teshub was considered analogous to the Mesopotamian weather god Adad. A degree of syncretism between them occurred across northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BCE due to the proliferation of new Hurrian dynasties and eventually the rise of the Empire of Mitanni. But its precise development is not possible to study yet due to lack of sources which could be a basis for case studies. While Hurrian rulers are not absent from sources from the Old Babylonian period, they attained greater relevance from the 16th century onwards, replacing the formerly predominant Amorite dynasties. As a result of this process, Teshub came to be regarded as the weather god of Aleppo. However, as Semitic languages continued to be spoken across the region, both names of weather gods continued to be used across the Middle Euphrates area. While the equivalence between Teshub and Adad is not attested in the Mesopotamian god list, An equals Anum, he is directly referred to as one of his foreign counterparts, specifically that linked to Subartu is another similar text, K2100. In a single passage from the Song of Hidamu, Teshub is addressed with the title Canal Inspector of Mankind, which most likely originates in the Babylonian Melu. Anu's status as the father of Teshub also mirrors Mesopotamian tradition. This idea might have reached the Hurrians as early as in the Akkadian period. Daniel Schwimmer notes it is possible that in turn, the tradition according to which Adad was a son of Dagon was influenced by Hurrian religion and was meant to mirror the connection between their Hurrian counterparts, Teshub and Kumarbi, and argues it is questionable if it was envisioned similarly before the arrival of the Hurrians. According to Louis Falloux, while a father-son relationship between Dagon and the weather god is only directly attested in Ugarit, it can be assumed it is already implicit in Old Babylonian text. Remnants of the period of Hurrian cultural influence are also still visible in a number of Neo-Assyrian traditions pertaining to Adad. The Takutu text indicate that his bulls, Sarai and Hurai, were incorporated into the circle of deities associated with Adad in both Ashur and Kerbel. The fact that he was invoked alongside Ishtar in contracts is presumed to reflect the association between Teshub and Sauska. Beat Pongratz Leyston argues an example of Hurrian mythology being reflected in an association between these Mesopotamian deities is already present in a curse formula of Adad Nerari I. At the same time, it is considered implausible to assume that the widespread veneration of Adad, attested in Assyria in the Middle Assyrian period and later, was the result of Hurrian influence, and most likely it should be instead interpreted as a case of cultural continuity, as evidenced by the broad distribution of the evidence for worship of Adad of Ashur, attested even in Hittite sources. In Ugarit, Teshub was identified with the local weather god Baal. It is presumed that the latter developed through the replacement of the main name of the weather god by his epithet on the Mediterranean coast in the 15th century BCE. In modern scholarship, comparisons have been made between myths focused on their respective struggles for kingship among the gods. While Baal does not directly fight against El, the senior god in the Ugaritic pantheon, the relationship between them has nonetheless been compared to the hostility between their Hurrian counterparts, Kumarbi and Teshub. Additionally, similarly to how Baal fought Yam, god of the sea, the Caucuses was also counted among Teshub's mythical adversaries, and both battles were associated with the same mountain, Hazai. However, myths about Baal also contain elements which find no parallel in these focused on Teshub, such as the confrontation with Mot, the personification of death, and his temporary death resulting from it. In contrast with Teshub, Baal also did not have a wife, and in Ugarit Hepat was seemingly recognized as a counterpart of Pidre, who was regarded as his daughter rather than spouse. For uncertain reasons, a trilingual edition of the Widener God list from Ugarit equates Teshub and Baal not only with each other, but also with the Mesopotamian goddess Mzuana. As her character was dissimilar, Aaron Tugendhaft has suggested that this connection might be an example of scribal wordplay, as the first sign of Mzuana's name is identical with the Sumerogram Im, used to represent names of weather gods. He concludes that it is unlikely the list can be used as a point of reference for either Hurrian or Ugaritic theology. It has been argued that the theonyms Teshub and Baal were both used interchangeably to refer to the local weather god in Emar. However, most likely his principal name in this city was Adad, and Baal served only as an appellative. It is possible that in the local pantheon, the relationship between him and Ashtart was imagined similar to the bond between Teshub and Saska in Hurrian mythology, as evidence for alleged consort relation between them is lacking. Anatolian weather gods. In Kumani in Kizuwatna, Teshub was identified with the local god Manuzi. The latter was regarded as the spouse of the Hurrian goddess Leluri. Starting in the Middle Hittite period, the Hittites, due to growing Hurrian influence on their culture, came to associate Teshub with their weather god Tarhuna. The character of the Luwian weather god Tarhuns also came to be influenced by the Teshub, a factor facilitating interchange of traits between these Anatolian weather gods, their Hurrian counterpart, and other weather deities such as Hattian Taru and Mesopotamian Adad, who was the use of the same Sumerogram to represent their names. In some cases, Hittites adopted Hurrian texts focused on Teshub, including hymns, prayers, and myths, but substituted his name for that of their own analogous god. Sources such as ritual texts pertaining to the worship of Saska in Samua instead preserve cases of what, according to Piotr Taracha, can be described as interpretatio heretica, namely referring to various Anatolian weather gods with the name Teshub. However, as noted by Gary Beckman, full conflation of deities was rare in Hittite religion and generally should be considered late and exceptional, with individual weather gods maintaining separate identities. Teshub's bulls were incorporated alongside him into the Hittite pantheon, but it is possible the image of a weather god traveling in a chariot drawn by bulls was not present in Hittite culture exclusively due to Hurrian influence, as the bull was already the symbolic animal of the weather god earlier in the Old Hittite period. While in Hittite texts postdating the introduction of Hurrian deities, Teshub might appear alongside Suwaliat, who corresponded to Tazmisu, there is no evidence that a connection existed between this Anatolian god and Tarhuna in earlier periods. Their juxtaposition was influenced by traditions imported from Kizuwatna. In order to reconcile the standard Hittite pantheon and the dynastic pantheon, including Hurrian deities, attempts have also been made by Hittite court theologians to equate Hepat and the sun goddess of Arena, as attested, for example, in a prayer of Pudahepa or Pudahepa. But according to Piotr Taracha, it is implausible that these ideas found support among the general populace. In the first millennium BCE, the identification between Teshub and Tarhuns is implicitly attested in text from Baal, where the latter came to be regarded as the husband of Hippat. However, according to Manfred Hutter, it is not possible to speak of Luwianized form of the worship of this goddess in earlier periods. Through Luwian influence, she was worshipped alongside Tarhuns in Carchemish as well, but she was not incorporated into the religion of the Aramaeans and eventually gradually disappeared from sources from Syria over the course of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. It is also possible that the echoes of the myth about Teshub's birth are preserved in a hieroglyphic Luwian inscription from Arsuz, which names the male deity Kumarma as Tarhuns' mother, similarly to how a Hurrian myth refers to Kumarbi as Teshub's mother due to the circumstances of his birth. Worship. Teshub was one of the oldest Hurrian deities. He is considered a pan-Hurrian god. As such, he was worshipped in all areas inhabited by the Hurrians, from southeastern Anatolia to the Zagros Mountains. Similarly to deities such as Sauska, Semij, Kusu, and Kumarbi, he is first attested in Hurrian theophoric names from the Third period. The single oldest example is Teshub Salag, Teshub Salah. Translation of the second element is unknown, identified in a document from Pusrish Dagon from the 7th year of Shusen's reign. It is also presumed that the Sumerogram representing a weather god in the inscription of Tish Atal of Urkesh should be interpreted as an early reference to Teshub. According to Daniel Schwimmer, it can be considered the first direct reference to this god outside of personal names and dates to the late Third period. Little is known about the history of the cult of Teshub prior to the rise of Hurrian dynasties in Upper Mesopotamia. Theophoric names invoking him were not yet common in the periods predating the time of the Meroe archives. In addition to examples from this text corpus, a few are known from Old Babylonian, Dilbat, Kish, Sipar, Kisura, Alalak, Tel Leland, Tel Al-Rima, and Tel Shemshara. One Old Babylonian example is Teshub Urur. Teshub is Lord, presumed to refer to his position as the head of the pantheon. By the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Teshub became the deity most commonly invoked in Hurrian theophoric names. Many royal dynasties across Upper Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia considered Teshub their tutelary deity. According to Piotr Tarasha, this might have been a result of the influence of the tradition of Yam Had, centered in Aleppo, in which the god confirming royal authority was Adad, later syncretized with Teshub in the West. Kumi, Akkadian Kumu or Kumum, Hittite Kumaya, Eurasian Kumenu or Kumenu, was the main cult center of Teshub. It is also the first attested city associated with him. It is to be distinguished from Kumani in Kizuwatna. Its precise location is not known. It is presumed that it was located east of the Tigris in the valley of the eastern Khabur. It has been suggested that it is to be found in the immediate proximity of modern Zakko, but according to Karen Ratner, textual sources indicate a more mountainous environment, which led her to suggest identification with Bey Tusabap instead. The city is already attested in text from the Old Babylonian period. As a cult center of a weather god, it enjoyed trans-regional renown comparable to Aleppo. A list of deities invoked in an oath from Merai recognizes these two cities as the two main cult centers of weather gods. It forms a part of a treaty between Zimri-Lim and a king of Kurda. A text from the same city written in Hurrian directly refers to Teshub Ba'am Ku'ume Na'in, Teshub of Kum or Kume. Zimri-Lim also dedicated a vase to the weather god of Kume. The inscription renders the name logographically or iographically in cases where logographic writings are used to spell the name. It is not certain if speakers of Semitic languages, Akkadian and Amorite, necessarily referred to the god of Kume as Adad or with his Hurrian name. In some cases, Kume occurs as a theophoric element in personal names from various Hurrian sites, Nuzi and Tikunani, as well as from Marriott and Middle Assyrian archives such as Kumen Adal, Kume is strong, or Kumen Erwi, Kumi is Lord, according to Daniel Schwimmer, possibly functioning as a stand-in for the name of its god. Marie-Claude Tremouille interprets this phenomenon similarly, presuming that the name Kumen Atal is to be translated as the weather god of Kume is strong. However, according to Thomas Richter, such names reflect the perception of the city itself as a numen. The last references to Kume occur in sources from the Neo-Assyrian period. The weather god of Kume, whose name was written logographically, was recognized by Assyrian rulers. He is mentioned as Iskar Sakume in the so-called Gadarad Respuk, a text listing deities worshipped in Ashur, while Adad Nerarai II visited the city itself in 895 BCE to make an offering to him. According to Daniel Schwimmer, while the king referred to the god of the city as Adad, this should only be considered a case of what he seems interpretatio Assyria, per analogy with a later religious phenomenon referred to as interpretatio Graeca. At the time, Kume was an independent polity under the control of local rulers. The city's status as well-established religious center might have been the reason why it retained independence. A further Assyrian reference to Kume occurs in the personal name Baal Kume Eli. The final fate of the city is uncertain, as it is no longer attested in sources from the reign of Sennacherib and his successors. Kingdom of Arapa. The city of Arapa, or Arapum, or Al-Iliani, city of the gods, modern Kirkuk, was already known as a cult center of a weather god in the Old Babylonian period. The local temple was considered the most important sanctuary in the area east of the Tigris, in the proximity of Little Zab. It is possible that the local god was understood to be Teshub during the reign of Shamshi Adad I already. One of his inscriptions refers to sacrifices made during a festival, Hum Tum, held in Arapa in honor of a weather god and a sun god, and while the sumerograms used are usually interpreted as Adad and Shamash, it is not impossible that the deities meant were Teshub and Semij. Ultimately, it is possible that both Shamshi Adad I and his successor Yazma Adu referred to the god of Arapa as Adad. At the same time, according to Daniel Schwimmer, he was called Teshub by their contemporaries in Susara, as the local inhabitants, who apparently at one point dedicated 2 bronze vessels to him, were predominantly Hurrians. Information about the religion of the kingdom of Arapa, including the structure of local pantheons, is only known from administrative text. such as list of rations meant for the cults of specific deities. And list of oil rations, Teshub always occurs alongside Salska of Nineveh. It is also known that a festival in honor of a deity designated by the logogram Iskar took place in the 4th month of the local calendar, corresponding to June or July. While no inscriptions dealing with any building projects or votive offerings related to the worship of Teshub can be attributed to local kings, it is presumed they nonetheless engaged in such activities, and the lack of textual evidence might be accidental. Teshub is also attested in text from 2 other sites in the proximity of Arapa itself, Nuzi or Yorgantep, and Kuruhani or Tel al-Fakar. It is possible that a double temple excavated in the former of these cities was dedicated jointly to him and Salska. It might have been originally a temple of Ishtar instead, with its later Hurrian character resulting from the settlement of Hurrians in the 19th century BCE. Possibly this process was contemporary with the change of the name or refounding of the city, which was originally known as Gasur. Members of Teshub's clergy are mentioned in the Nuzi text, including Sangu priest and Intu priestesses. It is also known that he was worshipped in other settlements in the same area, Hilmani and Ulam, as well as in Tilla, possibly identical with the similarly named Til, which based on Old Babylonian records, was located in northeastern part of Upper Mesopotamia. In yet another city in the kingdom of Arapa, Surin-U, a double temple dedicated jointly to Teshub and the moon god Kusu existed. The importance of the cult of Teshub in the kingdom of Arapa is reflected in the large number of theophoric names invoking him, including these belonging to members of the highest strata of society. Teshub names predominate even among members of the royal family, with virtually all of the known kings and a half of the princes bearing them. Some of the identified names include Arip Teshub, Teshub gave; Egel Teshub, save Teshub; Fagar Teshub, meaning good is Teshub; Fond Teshub, meaning Teshub makes right; Hizmi Teshub, or shiny is Teshub; Kibi Teshub, or Teshub sent; Tadip Teshub, or Teshub loved; Teshub Adal, or Teshub is strong; Teshub Iri, Teshub is Lord; Teshub Madai, Teshub possesses wisdom; Tun Teshub, Teshub could; Tupi Teshub, Teshub is here; Un Teshub, Teshub came, or he, the child came, O Teshub. The hypocoristic Tesoya and uncommon hybrid Hurro-Akkadian names such as Teshub Nerarai, Teshub is my help, or Wara Teshub, servant of Teshub. It has been noted that similar theophoric names invoking Teshub are also attested in text from contemporary Assyrian and Babylonian sites, for example, Nippur. In text from this city from the Kassite period, 15 different examples are attested, which make Teshub the most common non-Mesopotamian, non-Kassite deity appearing in theophoric names from this corpus, and the 16th most common overall. Aleppo. The temple of the weather god of Aleppo was already considered a major sanctuary in the Eblaite text, which predate the Sargonic period. In a treaty from Marai, the weather gods of Aleppo and Kume appear separately from each other as the 2 most important weather deities invoked. Hurrianization of the site presumably only occurred in the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Due to growing Hurrian influence in northern Syria, the deity venerated there, originally Adad, came to be identified as Teshub instead. According to Alfonso Arshai, he was effectively superimposed over the older god. For example, a festival originally dedicated to Adad, which took place in the month Hayyaru, was later held in honor of Teshub. According to Gernot Wilhelm, the hypostasis of Teshub associated with Aleppo became the most important local variants of this god, as evidenced by attestations spanning from Hattusa and Ugarit in the west to Nuzi in the east. The Nuzi evidence includes references to Isker, Halba, J, or G, and to a deity named Halbe or Har Bahi, the divine Halabian. Halab being the Akkadian name of Aleppo, presumably the name figure or the same figure. In Ugaritic text written in the local alphabetic script, Teshub of Aleppo appears as TTB HLBG. Traditions of Aleppo, including those related to Teshub, presumably also reached Kizzuwatna. The temple of the weather god in Aleppo was renovated around 1100 BCE by a Luwian prince, Taita, who added a relief depicting himself next to an older depiction of the deity dated to the 14th or 13th century BCE. It remained in use in later times, but the main deity of the city was no longer Teshub. The local god was instead identified as Tarhuns in hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, Hadad in Aramaic text, and Adad in Akkadian ones from both Babylonia and Assyria. Kumani and other Kizzuwatnian sites. Teshub was worshipped in Kumani in the north of Kizzuwatna, a kingdom located in the plains surrounding modern Adana. A number of ritual texts focused on him, presumed to come from this area, reflected the theology of Aleppo. Sources from Kizzuwatna often linked him with Hamri or Ha'amri, a type of buildings originally associated with oath-taking and judicial procedures in Upper Mesopotamia and in the north of Babylonia, as already attested in the early 2nd millennium BCE. A Ha'amri was connected with the cult of Adad in Old Babylonian Shadupam, but Old Assyrian sources do not connect it with the worship of any weather god. In Hurrian tradition or of Kizzuwatna, these structures could also be associated with Ishara. There is no indication that Hamri buildings were a part of temples, and most likely the worship of individual deities in association with them reflected their connection to oaths, justice, or omens. A festival meant to guarantee the well-being of the royal couple dedicated to the gods of Kumani, including Teshub Manuzi, was later celebrated in the Hittite Empire, but according to copies from the times of Pudu-Hepa, the inscriptions were passed down from Kizzuwatna. Kahat and other Mitanni sites. While material evidence of the worship of Teshub in the Mitanni state is limited, it is agreed that it was widespread. Tushratta, in the letters he sent to Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, part of the Amarna letters corpus, refers to Teshub as his lord, and in a blessing formula invokes the lead deities of the pantheon, him and Sauska, alongside Amun, rendered in Hurrian as Amanu, who occupied a comparable position in ancient Egyptian religion. Teshub's major cult centers in Mitanni territory were Kahat, Wasukani, Uhu Sami, and Irid. His hypostases associated with them are all listed among the witnesses in a treaty of King Shatawaza. The enumeration of these manifestations, as well as various local deities, had a political dimension and was meant to help with defining the area regarded as the core territory of the kingdom. Kahat, modern Tel Barai, which was located in the proximity of Shekna, was the primary site associated with Teshub, located in the heartland of the Mitanni state. It was already recognized as a cult center of a weather god during the Old Babylonian period, as early as during the reign of Shamshi-Adad I, but there is no evidence that he was identified as Teshub yet prior to the establishment of Mitanni presence in the 15th century BCE, as documents from the reign of Zimri-Lim indicate the city's rulers were Amorites rather than Hurrians. In the Shatawaza Treaty, Teshub is designated as the Lord of Kurenu of Kahat, presumably either a type of house or worship or emblem. Vokert Haaz asserted that a reference to Teshub of Kureni appears in an inscription from Kahat as well, but according to Daniel Schwimmer, this is an error, as no such a text actually exists. It is known that a temple existed in this city. It occurs for the last time in an inscription of Shalmaneser I, commemorating its renovation, which refers to the god worshipped in it as Adad. Of the remaining cult centers listed in the same treaty, Wasukani was the imperial capital and might be identical with Sekani, attested as a cult center in Adad in Neo-Assyrian sources. Uhu Sumani is not otherwise known, and Erid, whose local hypostasis of Teshub was called the Lord of the Kamaru, presumably a type of emblem or temple, much like Kurenu, might correspond to Tel Bandar Han. Middle Assyrian sources mention two further cities which might have been Mitanni-affiliated cult centers of Teshub, namely Sura and Isana. The former is only attested in a single source and might correspond to modern Savur. The text from this site mentions a weather god and a city deity bearing a Hurrian name, Suriha, belonging to Sura. Other Hurrian attestations. Numerous names invoking Teshub are known from the text from Tigun Anum, a city located to the north of Tur Abdin and south or southwest of the Tigris, whose exact location remains unknown due to the tablets coming from illicit excavations. During the reign of Hattusili I, the king of this city bore the theophoric name Tunib Teshub. Additionally, the so-called Tikunani prism, which lists the predominantly Hurrian names of men belonging to the king's forces, includes 9 theophoric ones invoking Teshub. Teshub was also worshipped in Haberatum, a city northeast of the Sinjar Mountains already ruled by a Hurrian king, Nanip Sarai, in the times of Zimri-Lim, though it is presumed that since the name was written logographically in his letters addressed to the latter ruler, their recipient presumably would read the Sumerogram used as Adad. In text from Tel al-Rema or Katara, theophoric names invoking Teshub are attested, but they are rare, with the only examples identified so far being Arip Teshub, meaning Teshub gave, and Teshub Uri, Teshub is the Lord. In 1944, Ignace J. Gelb has proposed that a deity possibly designated as Dagon of the Hurrians, Sa-Harai, often interpreted Sa-Huri, in a late Old Babylonian inscription of King Sunuru-Amu of Kana from Turka, can be understood as Teshub, but this view is no longer accepted today, and most authors consider him to be Kumarbi instead. Louis Falou outright rejects the possibility that a Hurrian deity is meant and instead interprets it as a reference of a hypostasis of Dagon analogous to Ker in Ha'arai, attested in text from Emar. A certain Eli Teshub was the king of Als, a state which belonged to an anti-Assyrian coalition during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I. Various kings with names invoking Teshub have also ruled over various small states in the upper Tigris area during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I. Kings of Shubria also bore theophoric names invoking him, as attested, for example, in text from the reign of Esarhaddon. Tabatum at some point apparently was ruled by a certain Akit Teshub, as indicated by an inscription of his descendant Adad Bel Gab or Gabi. Ugaritic reception. Texts from Ugarit from the 13th century BCE indicate that Hurrian deities, including Teshub, were worshipped in this city. Alfonso Arshai has argued that the Hurrian pantheon of Ugarit as a whole was influenced by the tradition of Aleppo. However, Piotr Tarasha maintains that it represented a distinct tradition. Offering lists from Ugarit show a merging of Hurrian and local traditions and combine figures from both pantheons, with Ugaritic deities such as El or Anat appearing in Hurrian context. One of such texts places Teshub between El and Kusu, and another, offerings to him are prescribed twice, and in both cases take place between these dedicated to El and Kumarbi. In a ritual text written in a combination of Hurrian and Ugaritic, which mentions both Sauska and Ashtart, he is placed between El and the former of these two goddesses in an enumeration of deities receiving offerings. Overall, Teshub's position in the Hurrian offering list from Ugarit can be compared to Baal's in these reflecting strictly local tradition. Numerous theophoric names invoking Teshub are attested in the Ugaritic text corpus. As of 2016, 70 individuals bearing them have been identified. This makes him one of the 5 deities most common in theophoric names attested in sources from this site. And while he is not as common as El and Baal, he does appear with frequency comparable to Resheph and Shapash. Examples include Anani Teshub, Teshub rejoiced; Arai Teshub, Teshub gave; Kel Teshub, Teshub leaves unscathed; Talmi Teshub, great is Teshub; Uri Teshub, Teshub is here; and the bilingual hybrid name Ili Teshub, my God is Teshub. Wilfred H. Van Solt has argued that in this context, it is quite possible that with the name Teshub, not the main god of the Hurrian pantheon is meant, but the principal deity of Ugarit, with the Hurrian god only being a stand-in for Baal. However, Mary E. Buck, in her analysis of Ugaritic and Amorite naming patterns, concludes that in Ugarit, the local weather god and Teshub coexisted. She notes that his importance separates this city from other Amorite sites. Hittite reception. Teshub was also worshipped by the Hittites. However, while Hattusili I already mentions that he plundered the statue of a weather god from Hasua and brought it with him to Hattusa, there is no evidence that Teshub or other Hurrian deities was already worshipped there in the Old Hittite period. It is possible that he was first introduced to Hittite lands by Suppiluliuma I. Piotr Tarasha links his introduction to the start of the reign of a new dynasty which originated in Kizzuwatna. In Hittite sources, Teshub was recognized as the head of the dynastic rather than national pantheon, and much like in the Mitanni Empire and many other kingdoms, he was regarded as a royal deity. The introduction of Teshub and other Hurrian deities did not result in the Hittite deities being no longer worshipped. However, in Hattusa, a temple of the Hittite weather god referred to Taparwasu locally was reassigned to Teshub of Aleppo. The worship of this hypostasis of him in this city had essentially Hurrian character. The cult of this form of Teshub and of his spouse Hepat attained a degree of importance in Hittite religion. 13 festivals were held jointly in honor of them, which had been interpreted as an annual cycle of monthly celebrations, with the 13th being added on leap years. While the associated hypostasis of Teshub was the one linked to Aleppo, there is no clear indication that the individual celebrations originated in the tradition of this city. In Hattusa, Teshub of Aleppo was worshipped as Teshub of Aleppo of Hattusa, though references to Teshub of Aleppo of Kumani are known too, and according to Piotr Tarasha, reflect a connection between this city and the origin of the ruling family. In the Sun Asura Treaty, Teshub of Aleppo and Hepat appear directly after the main triad of Hittite deities, the weather god, the sun goddess, and a tutelary deity, logographically Lama. However, in other similar texts, hypostasis of Teshub could be listed among other weather gods right behind the sun goddess of Arena. According to a prayer of Muwatalli II, a temple dedicated to Teshub of Aleppo and Hepat existed in Herma, east of Kanesh. However, in this city, as well as in Uda, both Teshub and local weather gods were worshipped. As a dynastic deity, Teshub was recognized as the head of the local pantheon of Sapinua, where Tudhaliya III resided in the early years of his reign. Similarly, when Mursili II moved to Katapa in the final period of his reign, he introduced Teshub to this city, and his cult eclipsed that of local deities such as the so-called Queen of Katapa. During the reign of Muwatalli II in Arena, two hypostases of Teshub qualified by Hurrian epithets, Elibi of salvation and Suharibi of life, were worshipped alongside the local pantheon. The sun goddess of Arena, Missoula, the deified mountain Hula, Zentui, and a different weather god who represented a minor category of so-called storm gods of the forest. In Ankua, during the reign of Tudhaliya IV, Teshub was worshipped during the Antasum festival. Teshub of Kumi and Teshub of Arapa were recognized by the Hittites too. Other hypostases of this god worshipped in the Hittite Empire included Teshub of Kizuwatna, Teshub of Manuzi, Teshub of Sapinua, and Teshub of Dermita. Furthermore, weather gods designated by the terms Muwatali, meaning mighty, and Pi-Hasasi of lightning, the personal tutelary deities of, respectively, Mursili II and Muwatalli II, should be considered forms of Teshub according to Piotr Tarasha. However, Manfred Hutter argues that Pi-Hasasi instead referred to the Luwian weather god Tarhuns. Gary Beckman similarly classifies him as Luwian, while Susan Herbort treats him as the distinct form from Teshub. Tarasha assumes a further Hittite hypostasis of Teshub was the weather god of the camp, Karas, who he interprets as his aspect as the king's tutelary deity in war due to his apparent association with Zithariah well attested in such a role. Teshub is among Hurrian deities identified on the reliefs from the Yazalakaya sanctuary, the central of which 42 depicts him standing on the napes of two mountain gods alongside his family. Hepat 43, Saroma 44, Alonzu 45, and Kun Zasali 46. The procession of deities following him broadly follows the order of his Kaluti, though a specific Hurro-Hittite ritual text directly matching the reliefs has yet to be found. The deities following Teshub have been identified as Taz Misu, Kumarbi, Ie, Sauska with Nenada and Kulita, Kusa, Samij, Astabi, Nupatik, Perengir, Hesui, symbol of heaven held by two bull men standing on a symbol of earth, Ugur, Pisai, Safi, 13 unidentified deities, and 12 gods of the underworld. As a result of Hittite influence, Teshub is among the deities mentioned in a ritual text from Imar, which, despite being written in a local dialect of Akkadian, is described as Tablet of the Rites of the Gods of Hattiland or Hattiland in its colophon, and reflects Hittite rather than local beliefs. Names such as Iri Teshub, Kundi Teshub, meaning uncertain, Mudri Teshub, meaning uncertain, Talmi Teshub, or Ikon Teshub, Teshub was faithful, the first element is not Hurrian, are attested in text from the same city as well. But most of their bearers were members of the Hittite administration stationed in Carchemish rather than local inhabitants. Luwian reception. Due to Hurrian influence on various Luwian communities in southern Anatolia, Teshub came to be regarded as the head of many local pantheons. It is known that he could receive Luwian epithets, but it is not certain if figures referred to with the titles Pi Hamai or Pi Hamai, hurling lightning, Wara Hitasis of help, Ara Yadali mountainous, and Dupatanasi punishing, can be necessarily identified as hypostasis of him rather than his natively Luwian counterpart Tarhuns. In the first millennium BCE, in the kingdom of Baal, whose local Luwian pantheon has been described as Hurrianized, Teshub was seemingly identified with Tarhuns, and the latter was worshipped alongside originally Hurrian deities, including Hepat, Sarumu, Alonzu or Alasua, Kubaba, and Iya. It is presumed that the religious developments in Baal had strictly local character, and Manfred Hutter outright suggests referring to local beliefs as Tabalian religion as opposed to Luwian or Hurrian. While Teshub's name stopped being the default designation for weather gods in northern Syria in the first millennium BCE, he is still attested in theophoric names in Carchemish in this period. Additionally, 2 inscriptions from Tel Barsip indicate that he continued to be worshipped at least in this location as a secondary weather god distinct from Tarhuns. One of these texts has been commissioned by Hamayata, king of Masuarai. Tarhunt of heaven, King Ea, Kumarbi, grain god, Teshub, Haranian, moon god, and Kubaba and other gods loved me, the firstborn son, as a child. Mythology. Teshub and Kumarbi. The best-known myths focused on Teshub belong to the so-called Kumarbi cycle. It describes his ascent to kingship and challenges he subsequently faces due to the machinations of Kumarbi. Carlo Corti notes that despite its conventional modern title, it might be more appropriate to refer to it as the cycle of Teshub. This renaming proposal is also supported by Piotr Tarasha. Eric Van Dongen also argues that the old label needs to be reconsidered and acknowledges Teshub rather than Kumarbi as its primary character, though he considers a title more broadly referring to kingship in heaven rather than to a singular deity to be preferable. It is not known how many myths originally formed the cycle. It is also possible that more than one cycle of myths focused on the conflict between Teshub and Kumarbi existed. The conventional reconstructed sequence cited in modern literature consists of 5: Song of Emergence, Song of Lama, Song of Silver, Song of Hidamu, and Song of Ulikumi. According to Alfonso Arshai, the last 3 myths are arranged on the increasingly more threatening nature of their antagonist, though he also stresses that it cannot be assumed they form a coherent whole. It is uncertain if the Song of the Sea was also a part of the cycle, and which position it should occupy if this classification is accepted. Multiple further fragmentary texts possibly also related to these narratives have been identified, including Ea and the beast and a fragment focused on the deity El Tara. The individual myths all portray Kumarbi's plots against Teshub as initially successful in order to create suspense, but ultimately the younger god overcomes difficulties and emerges victorious. Both of the main participants in the conflict are aided by various allies, with Teshub being backed chiefly by figures associated with the sky, for example, Sauska, Semij, Kusu, Hepat, Takatu, Tazmisu, and Astabi, and Kumarbi, with these dwelling in the underworld or the sea. While Hittite translations of myths about Teshub could replace his name with that of Tarhuna, according to Gary Beckman, it is not certain if any of them were known to average Hittite or even to royal courtiers. Their plots do not reflect Hittite tradition, but rather the beliefs of Hurrians inhabiting the north of Syria and Mesopotamia, as indicated by their geographic setting, with direct references made to locations such as Tigris, Mukish, or Mount Hazai. The notion of kingship in heaven, commonly referenced in them, was otherwise largely absent from natively Hittite theology and can only be considered a literary borrowing. Most likely, Hurrian myths were imported from northern Syria and adapted in Hittite to serve as a form of scribal training and possibly as courtly entertainment. Some of the adaptations might have been prepared in Sapanua during the reign of Tudhaliah II or Tudhaliah III. Song of Emergence, Song of Kumarbi. Regardless of the number and arrangement of myths classified as a part of the cycle dealing with Teshub and Kumarbi, the same composition is agreed to be its beginning by experts. Until the 2000s, various provisional titles were used to refer to it in academic publications, for example, Song of Kumarbi or Kingship in Heaven. Eventually, it was established that the text was originally known as the Song of Emergence. The preserved tablet was prepared by the scribe Ashapala, who was active during the reign of Tudhaliah I. However, the composition is older, as the colophon mentions the existence of a damaged exemplar from which it was copied, which in turn presumably constituted a Hittite adaptation of unknown Hurrian originals. Only a single possibly related fragment written in Hurrian is presently known, KUB 47.56, but due to state of preservation and still imperfect understanding of the language, it does not shed additional light on the plot of the myth. The Song of Emergence describes Teshub's birth after an introductory section dedicated to the succession of primordial kings of the gods. He is conceived when Kumarbi seizes kingship among the gods after battling the previous deity who held this position, Anu, and biting off his genitals. After being mutilated, Anu mocks Kumarbi. Do not rejoice over your belly, for I have placed a burden in your belly. First, I have impregnated you with the mighty storm god. Second, I have impregnated you with the river Tigris, not to be born. Third, I have impregnated you with the mighty Tazmisu. I have placed 3 frightful deities as a burden in your belly, and you will end up banging your head against the rocks of Mount Tassa. As noted by Gary Beckman, due to his origin, Teshub effectively represents a fusion of 2 rival families of gods, one represented by Anu and the other god by Kumarbi and Alalu, who reigned in heaven before Anu. While Kumarbi manages to spit out Tazmisu, impregnating Mount Kansura with him as a result, in order to get rid of Teshub, he has to travel to Nippur in Mesopotamia, where he consults Ea about his condition. Teshub actively partakes in the discussion from inside Kumarbi's body and argues that it would be optimal for him to emerge from his head. In another passage in which he has yet to be born, he apparently indicates that he will receive various positive traits from other deities. In the section of the myth preceding his birth, Teshub is referred to as a Gilam and Kazal, possibly because he has yet to receive his proper name, or simply to let the scribes display their familiarity with various rare writings of theonyms. However, they are not used in such a context in any other text. Presumably, even at the time of compilation and copying of the text, they were obscure. They might have originated in multilingual lexical lists. Kumarbi's skull is eventually split to enable Teshub's birth, and afterward it has to be repaired like a garment by the fate goddesses, Gulses, in the Hittite adaptation. He is enraged by the ordeal and demands to have the child, referred to with the logogram Namhi, or abundance, and the past sometimes incorrectly interpreted as a separate female figure, handed over to him so that he can crush or devour him. However, he is tricked by unknown means into biting a piece of a stone instead, enabling his son to survive. According to Eric Van Dongen, following the earlier study of Anna Maria Polvani, it can be assumed the term used to refer to Kunuzi has no specific meaning and could refer to any hard stone, not necessarily to basalt, diorite, or granite as sometimes suggested. When the narrative resumes after an account of setting up the stone as a place where humans will make offerings, perhaps an etiology of so-called Huwasi stones treated as cult objects in Syria and Anatolia, and a gap, various deities are debating who will become the next king of the gods. It is not known what, if any, conclusion they reach, but they seemingly do not assign this position to Teshub. He is displeased by the discussion. In the following passage, he boasts about his own positive qualities and curses the other gods. His bull, Sarai, warns him about doing so. He singles out Ea in particular, but it is not certain if this is because he sees him as a uniquely dangerous potential opponent, or because he views him as a neutral figure who does not need to be antagonized. Teshub also mentions that he drove away a war god, represented by the logogram Zaba or Zababa, which might constitute an allusion to a lost episode dealing with a battle between him and Kumarbi involving a number of their respective allies. Alternatively, the unidentified war god might have been cursed due to not supporting Teshub enthusiastically enough during the debate about kingship, though this proposal remains purely hypothetical. It is possible that the confrontation between Teshub and Hurrian primeval deities also took place at this point and led to their confinement in the underworld described in other Hurro-Hittite texts. In a further preserved passage, someone informs Ea about Teshub's curse. In the past, it has been suggested that this deity, whose name is heavily damaged, is the poorly known possible Hattian goddess Torai, but this is now considered implausible. He apparently responds to it with a proverb: under the beer pot, a fire is placed, and that pot will boil over, possibly to be understood as a declaration that no god should tamper with him in such a way. Due to gaps, it is not certain how the remaining surviving passages are connected with the earlier sections of the myth, and if Teshub plays any role in them. Some of them deal with the birth of children of deified earth, but it is not certain if they are to be understood as adversaries of Teshub. An additional fragment of the Song of Emergence pertaining to Teshub might be preserved on the tablet KUB 33.105, which contains a dialogue between him and Anu. He recounts his conflict with Kumarbi, describing how he was sent 7 times to heaven, 7 times to earth, and 7 times to mountains and rivers. He also states he owes his wisdom to Nara and his virility to Anu, but the rest of this section is broken off. Song of Lama. The Sumerogram Lama can also be read as Kal, Kal, and therefore the name of the eponymous deity the Song of Lama focuses on is sometimes rendered as Kal too. The first surviving section describes a fight between him and Teshub, assisted by Sauska, which the siblings seemingly lose. Their opponent takes away Teshub's chariot and whip. He is then most likely appointed as a new king of the gods by Ea, but eventually he and Kumarbi grow displeased with his incompetence and seek to depose him. The rest of the myth is poorly preserved, but after a gap of underdetermined length, Lama and Teshub fight again, with the former apparently losing this time. Most likely he is not killed, but has to transfer the regalia of kingship to Teshub. According to Alfonso Arshai, Lama can be identified as the tutelary god of Carchemish, Karhuha, as evidenced by the use of this Sumerogram to designate him in a text attributed to Suppiluliuma I. The original meaning, the name of a type of protective deity in Mesopotamia, is not considered to fit the context. On the basis of identification of Lama as Karhuha, Arshai proposes that the myth was originally composed in Carchemish during a period of Mitanni domination under the influence of other narratives today considered to be parts of the Kumarbi cycle, and that while its fragmentary preservation makes interpretation difficult, Teshub's victory over the local god might have reflected the acceptance of supremacy of said dynasty. Song of Silver. In the Song of Silver, most likely translated into Hittite from a Hurrian original, presumably composed in western Syria, Teshub is first mentioned when the eponymous being is presented by the narrator as greater than the gods. Later, Silver learns from his mother, a mortal woman, that his stepbrother is Teshub and his father is Kumarbi, which prompts him to embark on a journey to the latter's sacred city, Urkesh. The rest of the narrative is not fully preserved, but it is presumed that he was enthroned as a temporary king of the gods. In a passage presumably following this event, Teshub is fearful of his power and questions if he can defeat him, prompting Tasmisu to taunt him over this display of timidity. While the surviving passages do not describe the dethroning and defeat of Silver, it is presumed the narrative nonetheless ended with these events due to parallels with other myths classified as parts of the Kumarbi cycle. Song of Hedamu. Song of Hedamu is focused on the struggle between Teshub and Saska and the eponymous being, a monstrous son of Kumarbi, and Sir Tapsuruhi, a daughter of his ally, the personified sea. Teshub first hears about this new opponent from Saska, who refuses to sit down, eat, or drink once she arrives with the news. Teshub becomes despondent after hearing them and starts to cry. Apparently, a brief confrontation follows and results in havoc among mortals, which prompts Ea to berate both sides, starting with Teshub and his allies. Ea began to say, "Why are you destroying mankind? They will not give sacrifices to the gods. They will not burn cedar and incense to you. If you destroy mankind, they will no longer worship the gods. No one will offer bread or libations to you any longer. Even Teshub, Kumaya's heroic king, will himself work the plow." Kumarbi is the next to be berated and apparently takes offense in it, which, according to Harry Hay Hoffner, might mark the point at which the two, portrayed as allies in earlier sections of the cycle, start to become estranged, which ultimately culminates in Ea advising Teshub instead in the Song of Uli Kumi. In the next passage, which is poorly preserved, Teshub and Saska talk about Hedamu. The latter concocts a plan to defeat him with the help of her servants Ninada and Kulita, the enactment of which culminates in the aquatic being leaving his throne under the sea and coming to dry land, is described in the remaining surviving fragments. While no surviving section describes the final fate of Hedamu, it is nonetheless assumed he was eventually defeated. It is not certain whether he was killed by Teshub or was allowed to live like Lama. Song of Uli Kumi. In contrast with many of the related narratives, the Song of Uli Kumi is relatively well preserved. It is considered the most complete myth of Hurrian origin presently known to researchers. It has been noted that its plot features a number of elements also present in the Song of Hedamu. According to Alfonso Archai, it might be derived from early Hurrian tradition, though the version known to the Hittites could only arise after Hurrian settlement in western Syria. The myth begins with the scene of Kumarbi plotting against Teshub. Kumarbi forms in his mind a clever plan. He raises an evil day in the form of a hostile man and makes hostile plans against Teshub. Kumarbi entertains wise thoughts in his mind and aligns them like beads on a string. When Kumarbi had formed a clever plan in his mind, he promptly arose from his chair. His plot revolves around the eponymous being, Uli Kumi, whose name means destroy Kumi, Kumi being both the main cult center of Teshub and his abode in myths. It is meant to describe his destiny, as he was created to supplant the weather god and destroy him and his city. He is described as a son of Kumarbi and an enormous boulder, and he is made out of kunuzi, hard stone, much like the rock Kumarbi bites into in the Song of Emergence. Kumarbi presents Uli Kumi to his various allies, including the deified sea, and describes what the stone creature is meant to accomplish. Let him go up to heaven to kingship. Let him suppress the fine city of Kumaya. Let him strike Teshub. Let him chop him up fine like chaff. Let him grind him up under food like an ant. Let him snap off Tazmisu like a brittle reed. Let him scatter all the gods from the sky like birds. Let him smash them like empty pottery bowls. However, he fears Ulikumi could be easily defeated while he is still small, and therefore sends him to spend some time in hiding on the shoulder of the giant Upeluri. He keeps growing, and due to his enormous size, he is eventually noticed by the sun god of heaven, Hurrian Semij, who immediately rushes to warn Teshub about this new adversary. The weather god sets up a chair, a meal, and a drink for him, but he refuses to sit down, eat, or drink, prompting his host to wonder if maybe they were set up improperly in the final lines of the first tablets of the composition. Presumably, the broken beginning of the second tablet contained an explanation of this misunderstanding, as in the next surviving passage, Teshub reacts to the bad news and reassures the sun god that he can sit down and eat and drink wine now. He then embarks on a journey to Mount Hazai with his siblings, Tazmisu and Sauska, and after reaching his designation, he finally sees Ulikumi himself, which sends him into despair. He describes how daunting of a task fighting him would be and starts crying. In order to help Teshub, Sauska attempts to woo Ulikumi with song and dance like she did earlier with Hadamu. However, after she dresses up, adorns her hair with seashells, and starts singing, a wave informs her that the target is deaf, blind, and unfeeling, which makes him immune to any such efforts, and suggests that she should instead try to get Teshub to confront him as soon as possible, as he will only continue to grow more dangerous. In the next surviving passage, Teshub tells Tazmisu to prepare the bulls, Sarisu and Tilla, and a chariot, and apparently a confrontation between him and Ulikumi occurs. The weather god loses it. Other gods, including Astabi, attempt to fight Ulikumi, but he continues to grow and eventually blocks the gates of Kumi, trapping Teshub's wife Hepat inside, unable to find out what happened to him. She worries that Teshub might have died in the battle and sends her messenger Takiti to find out what happened, but the rest of the passage is missing, and when the text resumes after a lacuna, Tizmisu arrives near her dwelling to reassure her that Teshub is alive, which almost makes her fall down from the roof. He then returns to Teshub's temporary dwelling and suggests to him that they need to meet with Ea and Apsua. After arriving in Ea's house, both of them bow down, though he is apparently angered by Teshub's presence. In a series of fragmentary passages, Ea then meets with various other deities, including Enlil, Upeluri, and the primeval deities, and tells them about Ulikumi. With the help of the primeval deities, he recovers a copper tool which was used to separate heaven from earth, and uses it to cut Ulikumi from Upeluri after realizing this connection is the source of the former's power. The separation negates the invulnerability he exhibited in earlier sections of the myth. Ea then tells Tazmisu that Ulikumi needs to be confronted for a second time. He reacts with enthusiasm and relays this information to Teshub before going with him to a place where the other gods hold an assembly. The rest of the surviving passages all describe the second encounter between Teshub and Ulikumi. The next passage has the form of a monologue. What can I say to you, Teshub? Keep attacking. Be of his mind, for Ea, king of wisdom, is on your side. What can I say to you, Teshub? I held counsel, and before my mind I lined up wisdom like a string of beads as follows. I will go up to heaven to kingship. I will take to myself Kamaya, the gods' holy temples, and the Kuntara shrines. I will scatter the gods down from the sky like meal. Ulikumi spoke again to Teshub. Behave like a man again. Ea, king of wisdom, stands on your side. It is not certain what happened next. The text breaks off after Uli Kumi's comments, but the existence of another now lost tablet describing the battle between him and Teshub has been proposed. Presumably, the weather god ultimately emerges as the victor, but the ultimate fate of Uli Kumi remains unknown. Other related texts. Due to the numerous references to an alliance between Kumarbi and the personified sea in the Song of Hadamu and the Song of Uli Kumi, it has been proposed that the Song of the Sea was another myth belonging to the same cycle. It was performed during a festival dedicated to Mount Hazai. While due to imperfect understanding of Hurrian, the plot is not fully known, most likely it focuses on a conflict between the personified sea and Teshub. Ian Rutherford suggests that it can be placed before Song of Hadamu, perhaps as the first half of the same narrative, with the sea's presumed defeat at the hands of Teshub motivating him to join forces with Kumarbi. As an alternative, he proposes placing it between the Song of Emergence and Song of Lama. Daniel Schwimmer instead argues that the conflict between Teshub and the sea might have constituted a finale of the cycle of myths focused on him, with the victory finally confirming his status as the king of the gods once and for all. A text related to the Song of the Sea and similarly focused on the conflict between this being and Teshub might be KBO 26.105, argued to represent a narrative comparable to Egyptian Astarte and the sea, due to the presence of a passage in which Kumarbi urges other gods to pay tribute to the sea. It might be a Hittite adaptation of the same myth. A reference to conflicts between Teshub and the sea, and the defeat of the latter also occurs in the myth of Pasisa, which additionally mentions that at some point, rebellious mountain gods seemingly stole the weapon the weather god used during it. The conflict between Teshub and the mountains is not otherwise well attested, though as the names of Namni and Hazai occur in a broken context in the Pasisa myth, it is possible that its outcome was the subjugation of these two deities. It has been proposed that the myth Ea and the Beast was another composition belonging to the Kumarbi cycle. It is possible that it can be considered an alternate or an alternative version of the same narrative as Song of Emergence, or that it at least repeats information also known from this composition. Yet another interpretation is that it fulfilled a different function altogether, such as that of a hymn in praise of Teshub. Its plot focuses on prophecies about a god who will be born soon, which an unidentified animal, Sapalanza, reveals to Ea. It is presumed that he can be identified as Teshub, and that the prophecies deal with his conflict with Kumarbi and ascent to kingship. A reference is made to sending opponents to the underworld, a motive also attested elsewhere in Hurrian tradition. For example, driving the primeval deities into the underworld is also mentioned in a passage from a purification ritual, which also states that the weather god was responsible for establishing the tradition according to which birds, rather than cattle or sheep, were seen as an appropriate offering for them. The Sapalanza also mentions that the god presumed to be Teshub will draw away a serpent, Iluyanka, but there is no indication that this is a reference to an extant Hittite myth whose antagonist is also called Iluyanka. Said narrative was connected with the traditions of the city of Nerik, derived from Hattian religion. Ian Rutherford notes that presuming the Hittite Eluyanka is meant would require assuming that a degree of cross-contamination with strictly Hittite tradition occurred, and additionally points out the relevant myth does not present him as a figure connected to the rise of any weather god to power. He also considers it unlikely that the passage is a reference to the Song of Hidamu. The text KBO 22.87 has been argued to be a further myth belonging to the Kumarbi cycle. It describes a period of time during which El Tara, one of the primeval deities, reigned as the king of the gods. Two of the surviving lines mention Teshub. In one, he apparently attains kingship like El Tara did, while in another, a number of servants submit to him. Anna Maria Polvani has suggested that the myth of El Tara might have dealt with the final enthronement of Teshub as the king of the gods. Comparative scholarship. Parallels between the myths about Teshub's struggle for kingship and between motifs from Greek mythology have been pointed out, with his ascent to the position of the head of the pantheon compared to the history of Zeus presented in Hesiod's Theogony. According to Gary Beckman, these similarities are not a sign that the conflict over kingship in heaven was a narrative of Indo-European origin, but rather instead an indication that it was what he deems a real feature known across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. It is also considered likely that the myth of Athena's birth from the split skull of Zeus was patterned on Teshub's birth. According to Amir Galan, derivatives of certain elements of the myths about Teshub might have reached Greece through the kingdom of Walistan, which retained aspects of earlier theology of Aleppo in the first millennium BCE, as indicated, for example, by inscriptions from Arsuz. Song of Release. Teshub is one of the main characters in the Song of Release, alternatively known as Epic of Freeing. As elsewhere in Hurrian mythology, he is portrayed as the king of the gods and as the lord of Kumi. The Song of Release is known from multiple fragments of bilingual editions, coupling the Hurrian original with a Hittite translation prepared by scribes from Hattusa around 1400 BCE. However, it is presumed that it was originally composed earlier, possibly in the 16th century BCE. The translation was most likely prepared to facilitate the learning of Hurrian language. The sequence of events in the myth remains uncertain, and the interpretation of its plot is a matter of scholarly debate. One of the only fixed points is the prorum. It introduces the deities playing the main roles in the plot. I will sing of Teshub, the great lord of Kumi. I will exalt the young lady Alani, the bolt of the underworld, and with them I will tell of the young lady Ashara, skillful in speaking, a goddess renowned for wisdom. The same section also introduces a man named Pizigara, said to come from Nineveh, but his role in the story remains poorly understood and he is not attested in any other sources. The central theme of the Song of Release is the freeing of the inhabitants of the city of Iginalis, who are kept as slaves in Ebla. According to Gernot Wilhelm, they are identified as enslaved prisoners of war as opposed to people subjected to debt slavery, though in older scholarship the text was sometimes interpreted under the assumption that the latter possibility is correct. Similar observations have been made by Eva van Dessau, who notes that the entire population of the city is deprived of freedom, which reflects subjugation in war. The city of Iginalis is also attested in historical records and most likely was either a tributary or a dependent territory of Ebla at some point. In one of the fragments, Teshub asks the king of Ebla, Megai, To release the enslaved inhabitants of Egan-Galis, he singles out a certain Purah who has served under multiple rulers already. Release the sons of Egan-Galis in well-being. Release the captive Purah who has served 9 kings. For Egan-Galis 3 kings he has served. For Ebla 6 kings he has served. And now for the 10th, Magi, before you he stands. He offers to bless the city if his wish is granted, and to destroy it in the case of denial. If you decree release for Ebla, the fate is this. You decree release to godlike power, I shall exalt your weaponry. Your weaponry will beat the opponent, gloriously shall your fields thrive. If you do not decree release, the fate for Ebla is this. On the 7th day, I shall come upon you. Like other human characters in this myth, Purah and Magi are not historical figures, and the name of the latter is derived from a title used by historical Eblaite rulers. Magi subsequently presents Teshub's message to the Senate of the city, where a certain Zazala, its speaker, argues against fulfilling the request. He sarcastically asks the king if Teshub himself lost his freedom, and states that if it was him who was in trouble, he and the Senate would be ready to help him, whether it was caused by debt, sickness, or any other factors, but there is no reason to do the same for the people of Egan-Galis. Magi subsequently meets with Teshub again. He explains the situation to him while weeping and purifies himself before the text breaks off. Due to the state of preservation of the fragments, it remains unknown if Ebla was destroyed by Teshub afterwards. According to Eva von Dessau, despite lack of direct references, it is plausible to assume that he fulfilled his threat. It is possible that the text served as an etiology. However, due to temporal differences, it is not likely that it reflects pre-Sargonic history of the city, and the described events might instead correlate with the destruction of Middle Bronze Age Ebla, which occurred around 1600 BCE. Mary R. Bakhvarova argues that at least some of the enslaved people were servants of Teshub, and that Zazala's speech is simply a description of the god's suffering in absence of proper services dedicated to him. She also assumes that Purah, unlike his compatriots, was instead responsible for the funerary cult of deceased rulers. Bakhvarova's interpretation has been criticized by von Dessau, who asserts that she misinterprets Zazala's speech to treat it as a description of Teshub's state caused by the neglect of religious duties pertaining to him, and that she incorrectly treats reverence towards the deceased as unique to Ebla and conducted by a dedicated staff. She instead argues Teshub intervened on behalf of the people of Egan-Galis simply because the gods were believed to enforce justice, and the narrative evidently portrays their enslavement as unjust. A poorly preserved passage apparently has the form of a dialogue between Teshub and Ishara. According to Alfonso Arshai, her aim is to protect the city of Ebla, which reflects her long-standing association with it. Outside of the initial invocation, this is the only surviving passage in which she appears. Another section of the text deals with Teshub visiting Alani in the underworld, alongside Tasmisu, Su-Waliat in the Hittite version, and the primeval deities, elsewhere consistently portrayed as his opponents. He takes part in a banquet organized with her, during which she serves her guests herself. Both the meaning of this episode and the nature of its connection with the sections of the text focused on Ebla and slavery are not certain, and multiple interpretations have been proposed. Eva von Dessau assumes that it follows a declaration that Ebla is to be destroyed and suggests Teshub might be meeting with Alani because her domain would have to accommodate many new inhabitants in the case of such an event. Gernot Wilhelm suggests that it takes place after the destruction of Ebla and that Teshub descends to the underworld to deal with his anger, which would reflect a motive well attested in literature of the region. Volkert Haas assumed that Teshub is imprisoned in the underworld. According to his interpretation, the weather god, as a result of eating during the banquet, was confined in the realm of the dead. However, as noted by Wilhelm, no actual reference to either the imprisonment or release of Teshub can be identified in the text. In her similarly critical evaluation of Haas's proposal, von Dessau calls his interpretation of the text incoherent and highlights that to justify it, he attempted inserting hypothetical elements not present in the actual narrative into it, such as the motive of food from the underworld, consuming which results in imprisonment there. Wilhelm instead suggests that the banquet mirrors the rituals meant to enable deceased rulers to enter the underworld with the deities inhabiting it, welcoming him with similarly to how ancestors were believed to do in the case of mortals. Harry A. Hoffner proposes that it reflects a temporary reconciliation between heavenly and underworld gods. As the colophon of the surviving copy of the section describing Teshub's visit in the underworld, KBO 32.13 designates it as a part of the Song of Release, but states that it is not finished. It is assumed at least one more tablet must have followed. However, the rest of the story is not known. Tales about human heroes. A reference to Teshub occurs in the tale of Apu. According to Gary Beckman, this composition should be classified as belonging to a genre distinct from myths. He states that in the context of Hurro-Hittite literature, the term tale is used to refer to narratives focused on human rather than divine protagonists and which lack cosmological implications, in contrast with myths. The passage which mentions Teshub enumerates the names and residences of various deities. In his case, Kumi also mentioned are a sun god, Sipar, a moon god, Kuzina, Saska, Nineveh, Nanaya, Kisina, and Marduk, Babylon. Similar enumerations of deities alongside their cult centers are well attested in various genres of text from ancient Mesopotamia and Anatolia. A fragment of a Hurrian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh also mentions Teshub. Beckman notes that while full translation and interpretation of this text is presently not possible, Teshub is seemingly ubiquitous in it, which can be contrasted with both the Akkadian original and the Hittite adaptation, where the respective weather deities play no significant role.